So, what Aristotle will allow us to do then is give us two dimensions of democracy. Because obviously we can have a democracy that tends towards the fewer, and we can have democracy that tends more towards government by the many. So we can ask these two categories. We can first ask who is allowed to participate in that government, who's allowed to vote, who's allowed to have their voice heard in making those decisions, and then who ultimately gets to make the decision. Who is the president? Who are the members of the legislature? And to the extent that we have fewer people involved in participating and fewer people involved in making decisions, we're going to call that sort of system more elitist. And to the extent that we're going to have many involved in participation and many involved in decision making, we're going to call that system more populist. And obviously, this is not a hard category. You can fall kind of anywhere within this space and within the spectrum. So when we start to think about some of the governments that we've already mentioned, ancient Greece is going to be one of those where not very many people honestly got to participate. So up here on this orange peg, ancient Greece might be there. Few people got to participate. You had to be a citizen of Athens. You had to be a man. You had to be military trained. At different points in time, you had to have parents or grandparents who were also Athenian citizens. It was fairly exclusionary. But of those who were allowed to participate, they got a hands-on role in every decision. They were included in the random lot to see who was going to be the leader of Athens. So they had a big role to play. They involved many in decision-making. They weren't purely elitist. They weren't purely populist. They were kind of a hybrid. America in the early days, when we have very few people that are allowed to participate, white landowning male citizens got to pick amongst themselves for another white landowning male citizen to go and represent them. Early America was fairly elitist. Whereas America improved over the intervening 250 years, well, we still have a relatively small number of people involved in the legislature. We still only have one president. The requirements for president being 35 years old, a natural-born citizen, et cetera, those things are still in place. So the decision makers haven't really changed much, but who is allowed to participate has. We now have much closer to universal suffrage. We have many more avenues for people to have their voice heard within the particular system. So again, it's not populist per se, but it is some sort of hybrid. And this honestly is where most modern day democracies lie. It would be impractical to have 330 or so million Americans all involved in making decisions directly, like the ancient Greeks. We do need some form of government to filter those things. So we get more Americans involved in choosing. We get more Americans involved in having their voice heard. But decision making is still filtered through a legislature and an elected government. In real world, there's not that many examples of pure populism, and where you do find it tends to be at the local level. So you might have still small towns with town hall meetings where everybody gets together in like the high school gym and has punch and cookies and decides whether they want to put a stoplight at the one major intersection in town or if the stop sign that's currently there is sufficient, and people can argue it out and make those sorts of decisions. But at a national level, there's really not much in the way of real populism in the real world. But it's a sliding scale, right? We can have situations where we might lean more towards populism or lean more towards elitism. So what we need is to get an idea of those ideal types, so those two extremes. So elitism, you're going to understand and see it the more restrictions there are to participation. So if we have requirements to serve, if we have this hypothetical, what does it take to be president of the United States? And we start looking at what are the qualifications to be president. There are formal qualifications, right? 35, natural-born citizen, citizen and resident of the United States for so many years. But we can also start to add on more things. It requires a lot of money. It requires the ability to ask for money. There's a certain shamelessness there that goes along with being able to raise the millions of dollars that it requires. Chances are you need to look good on TV, or at least not look terrible on TV, right? You need to have the support of the political parties, which means you probably need to fall into kind of an ideological spectrum and hold opinions on policies that align with one of the two major parties. There are lots of restrictions on both formal and informal on who can be and run for successfully the presidency. So the more restrictions that we have, the more elitist the system might be. The more barriers that we put up to voting, the more elitist the voting system might be. So there are elements of elitism within the American system, and a lot of those are, in truth, by design. Because there are good things about elitism. The more elite the government is, the more meritocratic we say that it might be, the more that we rely on people who are well-trained and smart. And the idea here is that we pick our best and our brightest to make those decisions for us. And that those folks then are insulated from the will of the public. They go to the best schools, they interact with each other, they know how to negotiate together. It's much more efficient because they can work together more closely. The downside of elitism is that it's insulated, right? The idea that every member of the Supreme Court has an Ivy League law degree tells us something about the court. There's only a handful of schools where you can go to and have a chance of being, an elite judge in the American system. Would it be likely that someone with a, let's say, University of Texas law degree would be equally as smart? Well, sure. But they are excluded before they even have the chance, right? So you get fewer voices, you get fewer ideas, you get less diversity within that system. There are certainly questions of whether you have upward mobility. Is it truly meritocratic, as in the hardest working and the best and the brightest truly rise to the top? Or do we have a system that locks out some people and benefits others? If you have a lot of family money and a family legacy, does that get you in to those Ivy League schools when your grades themselves might not have? Do we have people that emerge from families that are working class who have to work their way through community college and state schools, but they may be just as smart and perhaps harder working, but they're never given that opportunity. So if we limit upward mobility, if that's not really a path that's available to everybody, then our idea of the meritocratic system and elitism breaks down. And what Madison may be worried about is that as you get that insulated group, you might be having a tyranny of the minority, where a small select group are running the show for everybody else. And if you're a fan of old spaghetti westerns, if you have the good and the bad, you also have to have the ugly. And there's a saying that Washington, D.C. is Hollywood for ugly folks. And as you kind of go through your political leaders, your majority and minority leader in the Senate, your last two couple speakers of the House, presidential candidates from recent years, even media figures, we're not exactly sending our most handsome and beautiful folks out to Washington. So that's elitism. Let's flip over and hit the populist side. The idea of populism is that we are expanding engagement, we're expanding participation. Every restriction that we can remove is increasing our participation and moving us towards populism. But these things are difficult, right? The more inclusive that we are, the harder it is for the government to run efficiently. So if we want to allow everybody who is, potentially wants to be president to run for president, and we want to give them all a fair shake and a fair chance, that's going to get really messy, right? Every year, Santa Claus runs for president in Florida. Literally a man who has changed his name to Santa Claus and grew out the beard. And his platform is he wants to end the war on Christmas. So do I want him on stage with the Democrat and the Republican getting equal time on the news as people are having to investigate his policies for president? Well, chances are probably not. When Joe Exotic, that's the Tiger King, wanted to run for president in 2016, did I want him to have sharing stage time with Trump and Hillary? And now the answer is probably yes, I did, because that would have been way more interesting. But in the real world, no, I don't want Joe Exotic to ever get elected to the presidency. But if I'm going to set up those barriers and say that you have to meet certain criteria, then I am, by definition, excluding people. Now, there are inclusive practices that we have in the United States, the idea of like term limits, the idea of voter propositions. We don't have those in Texas, but lots of states will allow people to write laws and vote on them directly and have them added to the law books in their particular state. Juries, the idea that we get 12 random folks drawn off the street to decide guilt or innocence in a court of law. They're not supposed to be experts. You're supposed to get a jury of your peers. Those are populist institutions within the United States. What do we like about populism? It's more democratic, right? It's truly a majority rule. There's more people involved, so there's more ideas and more diversity of ideas. And hypothetically, it should be less ideological. You have less direct ties to particular teams and institutions because you have more people involved. The bad is that what Madison was worried about was tyranny of the majority, that it's simplistic. That what the people want is ever changing and people don't always make good decisions. He's worried that there could be a race to the bottom because what is the ugly of populism? The ugly of populism is visit a Walmart in the middle of the night at about 3 a.m. And just keep in mind that all of those folks are equal to you. And scroll down on YouTube to the comments section of some random video. And keep in mind that under populism, those folks' opinions and their vote is just as valid as yours. And the ugly of populism is at its heart the ugliness of people and how it is that we spend our time and our energy and how informed we choose to be about those political problems. So populism, in its extreme form, has some stuff that we like, but also stuff that could be rather worrisome. So the puzzle for democracy, and where we'll pick up next time, is we're looking for that Goldilocks zone. We want it not too hot, not too cold, not too elitist, not too populist. How do we incorporate the diversity of ideas and demands that are inherent in rule by the many into a system with the efficiency and stability that's offered with rule by the few? How do we find our happy medium? And with that, I will sign off until next time. Goodbye, all.